Welcome to episode 78 of the Cashflow Connections podcast. Our topic for today is how you can leverage technology with your real estate business. Over the last 20 years in particular, technology has obviously disrupted a lot of businesses and even sectors of the economy. Of course, real estate is no different. In fact, I found out something recently that really puts things in perspective about the MLS. For those of you who don't know, the MLS is a website that hosts all the current listings all over the US. Basically, it aggregates listings, makes them viewable for every realtor, and it's basically the lifeblood of almost any realtor's business. That website basically started including information for California purchases as late as 2002. That is how significant a change in the technological space can be, because that business has completely been revolutionized since that date, especially when it comes to California. Imagine how different the business was when all the listings weren't available on one singular website, or even a website at all. Previously, you had to keep a offline ledger, or maybe just know personally where listings were and where they were taking place, and it was all done by word of mouth. It's pretty remarkable. Well, there are things like that happening in the sector right now, and we're going to talk a little bit about what some of those are today. Okay, maybe it's not as significant as the creation of the internet and the founding of the MLS website, but there certainly are some new tools and tips and tricks and hacks that are coming out, and people should be paying attention to them because it can really help your business as a real estate investor, a real estate entrepreneur. So in this conversation today, we're going to start off by talking about customer relationship management, CRMs, and what some of those CRMs are that both our guest and I suggest for real estate entrepreneurs. We're going to talk about using technology as an assistance in lead generation. We have an interesting conversation about identifying a niche, targeting that niche using geo-targeting, creating a marketing campaign specifically for that niche, and then seeing the results, all tracking this through tracking systems. And we're also going to talk about some of the major social media platforms. It's hard right now to keep all of these active. And so investors need to understand what's actually going to give them the most bang for their buck. Is it Instagram? Is it LinkedIn? Is it Facebook? All of these have its different strengths and weaknesses and have different price points, etc. So we're going to have a discussion about where our guest thinks people should be paying attention. Also, don't forget, we currently have a mobile home park and self-storage fund, which is still available for commitments. We have already had more than 180 investors in the fund, about 12.5 million funded. There's about 17 assets that are already performing, and I've personally been on site and seen some very significant progress in a lot of these assets. So we're off to a really solid start. Now, of course, there's a lot of work to be done because we purchase assets that are mismanaged, but we've certainly seen some movement in the right direction. The fund is sponsored by Elevation Capital Group. They've actually been a guest on our program several times. If you want to check out some of their episodes, make sure to check out episode 53, where we talk about self-storage as an investment vehicle. As you probably know, I've talked about it many times, I've invested in virtually every type of real estate transaction that exists, especially when it comes to commercial, but I find it very hard to argue with the self-storage investment vehicle. Anyway, so if you're an accredited investor, we would love to include you in the fund. So if you haven't yet, make sure to go to cashflowconnections.com and create an account, and we can get you signed up immediately. You have instant access to those fund documents. All right, hope you enjoy the episode. How's it going, everyone? Our guest for today is Tyler Van Winkle, who is the Chief Marketing and Information Officer for Affinity Worldwide, which is a family of more than 85 brands that includes Think Realty, National Real Estate Insurance Corp., American Association of Private Lenders, and many more. He is also the co-founder of Rivet, which is a full-service technology and creative agency that serves as the branding and marketing arm of Affinity. Tyler has won multiple American Advertising Awards, Best of Shows, a Cannes Bronze Lion, and many more. He's also the owner or author of 5 patents in the tech space, and his products have been featured in publications like Wired.com, MIT Tech Review, TechCrunch, as well as the front page of the New York Times. So Tyler, thanks again for having us on. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
So Tyler, obviously, we're going to talk a lot about technology in the real estate sector, and that obviously can cover a very vast amount of content. But before we jump into that, I kind of want to hear a little bit about your background and what Affinity Worldwide does as a company.
Sure. So I started my career in the real estate technology space. I actually, in the early 2000s, started out building real estate software on the MLS side. Did that for about 4.5 years before I started jumping off into other facets of the technology industry. Over the last 19 years, I personally have been involved in 4 or 5 high-tech startups, including, natural language search with artificial intelligence backbones, meta real-time search, development environments for IVR development. And in that time period, also did a stint at one of the largest independently owned advertising agencies in the country. So got an opportunity to get my hands on a lot of things and work with some people that were really focused on innovation and disruption. When I came on at Affinity, it was in partnership with Rivet and was invited to sit on the executive team as their chief marketing information officer. And what we're focused on is the real estate investment industry, which is a very different industry, as you well know, than the MLS industry. A lot of that was born out of the insurance products that we created that were specific to this industry, but then creating more technology platforms to help this industry build standards and do better business as a whole. So a lot of our core assets at Affinity Worldwide are focused on those things, whether it's scoring rental properties or tenants for the rental properties, to Think Realty itself, which is really kind of an industry platform where we educate, give good content, and continue to kind of inform the masses about what real estate investing is and how other people are doing it.
Okay, got it. So basically, you're helping the technological component of all of these aspects of real estate. So for example, anything going from being an active investor, like identifying which tenants or which markets, to things like helping companies that are putting out a lot of content, educational content, for example.
Yeah, absolutely. As well as developing our own, right?
Okay, got it. So I'm definitely interested in kind of diving in there. So when you're looking at the space as a whole, let's start with the active side of things, because I think that is a lot of people that are listening are probably very interested in kind of the technological solutions that you're using to do that. So when it comes to things like, tenant selection or even market selection, what are some of the solutions that you're currently seeing as being, optimal and optimized in the marketplace?
That's a good question. So from a tenant selection standpoint, we tend to focus more on the asset than the tenant, right? And helping investors make good deals so that they have nice assets or good assets to offer their tenants. We have a product called RentFacts right now, which helps with that. So it takes census data and does a lot of different statistical algorithms across that census data to tell you what the risk score is, how we quantify it, could be in that property. From a tenant selection standpoint, what we're seeing is a lot of background checking. There's not really a good place right now where you get tenant history data. It's not like a credit score where you can go out and see every missed payment. So, we see a lot of background check, personal background check, criminal background check, and credit score data is what's being used for tenant selection. I don't know if that's truly beneficial for the landlord or not, but it's better than nothing. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And I actually didn't know you're affiliated with that company. In fact, if you Google RentFacts, I think you'll actually find an article that I wrote on the first page of Google, which is about the product, because I do like it a lot. And I do use it to this day when I'm doing underwriting for hard money loans. Nice. It's so I just give a quick shout out. I explain what the product is and some of the ways that people use it other than just, I guess, finding the assets themselves.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So like I mentioned, RentFacts leverages national census data as well as several other data points to come in and build scores around the quality of a property. That could be a crime indicator. That could be crime local to that area. That could be median income. Like, we take a lot of those factors into account to then give you a single score or an easy view of what we think the risk of a property is from an investment standpoint. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's remarkably accurate in the sense that if you go from one street to the next, and you can, with your eyes, you can feel the difference as you do go through that street, but you would anticipate that the census data wouldn't pick that up because how could it be that accurate as like your eyes? And it truly is. Just the difference of scores from, let's say, a 50 to a 45. You can feel that in reality. And I'm sure that you've probably spent a lot of time driving around different markets all over the country and been able to do that. So just to reemphasize the way that I use it, if I'm looking at a market and I'm doing a hard money loan for my personal portfolio, that's one of the first things I'll look at just to make sure that it's in the range. Because in certain ranges, if I have to take a property back, which I've never had to do, I don't want to own a property that's in that, 20 range. At least those are the metrics that I use.
Yeah.
Now, some people only buy properties in that 20 range because that's what their particular niche is. But it's a great product. And we'll link to that as well because I think it's a tool that more people should be using.
Yeah, agreed. And it's especially for a sight unseen buy.
Yep.
We also use it as part of our underwriting process for our insurance products.
Very cool. It makes sense. In these hard money loans, for example, I usually don't travel to see them because they're all over the country. And it's just for my personal portfolio with teams that I trust. But it is a great way to check that. Okay, cool. So that's a really good one for tenant selection as well as markets. You also mentioned the insurance product. How does technology play a role in the insurance side of the business, given that there's just so much data out there and where are you getting that data from and how do you analyze it and what products are you using or creating that help you go through that process?
Yeah, that is a deep question. So our insurance product, like I mentioned, is 100% geared towards this industry. What our insurance team and the founders of InRig and Affinity did very, very well is get to know the investor and being investors themselves, built a product from the ground up, I think 12 years ago, specific to the buy hold or the flip or the lender category in the non-MLS space. So we have one of the few programs out there that is truly customizable based on the investor's needs. For example, you can move properties from vacant to occupied in the same month, right? So we run a monthly schedule instead of an annual or biannual schedule. You can attach builder's risk. So there's a lot of things that we can do that most insurance companies can't or don't know how to do that's to the investor's benefit. To do that, it's almost, so we leverage almost 100% custom technology with our insurance product because it is so different than most of the other insurance products out there. So we've built from the ground up over the last probably 7 years, a lot of different tools that we leverage for that. And we are actually in the middle of making a huge investment internally on bringing that InsurTech even more up to date so that we can make better decisions faster. The amount of data that's on the market right now from a real estate perspective is almost overwhelming, right? And overwhelming to a point where you don't even know what data to trust or what to do with it when you do have it, right? You can do a Google search on an address and you can find 15 different places that are going to give you different levels of information about that address, right? From Google Maps to Zillow to even Trulia's out there. House Canary, like there's so many platforms providing it. We've worked some partnerships with some of the larger data providers in the United States right now to help ease the burden for both the end user as well as the insurance agent to get the right data faster and help people go through a validation process. And then continue to use our own data internally as we insure those properties over long periods of time to inform the process going forward.
Okay. And when you say insure those properties, is this truly like typical home insurance, as in this isn't someone that's buying and flipping a property. This is someone that just owns a property and they want to insure the physical structure of their home?
It's both.
Okay.
So it's a property and casualty offering. It's only non-owner occupied. We don't do owner occupied properties. Okay. So it's truly built for the investor. We do buy hold, we do flips. We have lenders such as yourself that buy insurance for properties that they're lending against. We have alternatives for forced placed offerings. I think we cover most of the industry between 1 to 4 units. And then we have additional commercial lines that we can run for larger multifamily units.
Okay. Got it. And I'm actually going to kind of go back and ask you some big picture questions because you mentioned that there's so much data out there. There is. If you're doing it at a passive level, it can be incredibly beneficial in the sense that you have access to all this information. You can make decisions relatively quickly. You don't have to spend your entire life focusing on acquiring data. But then as you start to get more and more serious, you want to get more and more accurate with that data. And it doesn't just mean, whether or not Zillow says the property is worth $100,000, right? You're trying to get the very, very to the dollar kind of thing. So what are the sources that you use for pulling that data? You mentioned census data, for example. There are other sources that you can reliably use as a metric to verify that those are accurate?
Yep. So census data is a great example of data that we use that's kind of outside the norm. The downside about census data is it has some temporal challenges, I guess is a good way to say it. It's not updated on a really regular basis. There is tax information that's public record, where if you can get access to it, depending on your county, is also highly valuable. From a bigger provider standpoint, from a passive perspective, we do a lot of work with Atom data and have had great results with them and providing some of that data. And then there's a few other kind of API type providers that we leverage on an automated basis, more on a one-by-one perspective to validate property information as well.
Okay, got it. And when you're looking at this, is like, let's say, for example, we're trying to establish what market there's going to be a significant opportunity in a particular asset class. Mm-hmm. What would be the funnel that you would go through to try to establish that? I'm not sure if that's something that you're really focusing on, but I would anticipate that that would be a great example of what someone may want to use your technology for.
Yeah. So from our technology's perspective, most of that is done internally for us. We don't have a big consumer offering from a market trends perspective. We report on a lot of market trends that we found in that data through our different vehicles, like the Think Realty magazine or the digital offering on thinkrealty.com. We found a lot of people in the market don't want to spend the time going through the data themselves. Mm-hmm. We just try to build our own opinion on what we think is happening, and we try to make that as unbiased as possible. There's big hitters out there that are constantly looking at that data and talking about the trends. We try to get into the data and make sure that we're talking about facts, if that makes sense. Again, your bigger providers are going to give you the bigger sets of data depending on the criteria that you want to look at. From Atom Data's perspective, we may go to them to look at the number of sold or the frequency of solds in a certain market area over a certain period of time to see if we can do some market analysis, and then do comparisons year over year within that to see if that market's getting hotter or if it's really staying the same, right?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Well, I guess the interesting follow-up question is, and I don't know if this is actually something that you're actually spending your time focusing on, to your previous point, but based on some of the data that you're compiling, are there any markets that you're seeing that are really either heating up or primed for investment or completely over purchased or completely over inflated, et cetera?
There are. I'm hesitant. I'm hesitant to give my personal opinion on a lot of that. I think what we're seeing right now is a lot of the Midwest markets are getting hotter and hotter. Yeah. And a lot of the coastal markets are looking into the Midwest to get a little bit more bang for their buck. We see a lot of saturation in the coastal markets. I don't think that's a big surprise or anything innovative to anybody that would be listening to this, right?
Right.
It's probably fairly obvious. I think there is a lot of saturation in other markets that we do see that have large investor pools in them already, right?
For sure.
Dallas could be an example of that.
Right. And, there's this combination of things where it's hard to juggle the two most important things, which is supply and demand, and also jobs, which is kind of how you paint the picture for the future. And so when you're looking at data like that, it's always interesting because you look at a market like Denver, for example, which is experiencing a never before seen types of price increases. But the argument is that, look, there's the job growth that's taking place. So in 5 years, these prices are justified. And it's hard to balance that without getting in your own personal bias. And, we just recently put an episode out about personal biases and cognitive biases. And the reason that they're important is because that's the way you actually build your own personal investment thesis. So just having the data is not enough because it's really how you analyze that. So I definitely.
We talked a little bit about contextual commerce in the same relevance, right? Like we create commerce in the context in which we live or view, right? It's perception based. And I think a lot of that is contextual commerce. I think I have a deep affinity towards Kansas City where I live, right? I also get to see a lot of the side streets and kind of wander the communities and see the opportunities. And since I also get to travel a lot nationwide, I get to see the variance in price, which is pretty significant.
Right.
Right. But so my context is very Midwestern.
Okay. Got it. So let's move on to kind of discussing the technological solutions from more of a owner operator, a more significantly invested real estate entrepreneur for some examples. So let's talk about technology as a business, right? Using technologies to acquire leads, for example, or nurture leads. What are some of your thoughts on what we are right now in terms of solutions that are available for these products, and what products or solutions are you using for your company?
Yeah. So this is a little more interesting to talk about, but it's kind of tough too, right? Because everybody handles their day-to-day different. One of the things we talked about at the conference, and I think it's an important thing to start on, is a lot of what technology is intended to do is to amplify things, right? If you don't have somewhat of a process that you're using without technology, implementing technology may be tougher than it is for someone that does have a decent process that they're using, a pencil to paper type process. I think there are a lot of tools out there, and some of them are focused on this industry and some of them are a little bit more generic. But I think that if you don't know how you want to implement them or you don't know what you want from them, you could be getting into trouble. So I would start by kind of throwing that out there. Make sure you know what you want. Going in a little bit deeper, I think that there's a couple things to consider. And I think that there's different sectors of technology that you have to look at. Lead generation is a lot different than lead management, right? There are some tools that do both. There are some tools that do both really well. And some of those tools are more expensive than others. We tend to look at those as two different things. So the way that we generate leads, or the way that I even personally generate leads, and the way that I manage those leads or work those leads are very different. The other thing about this industry that I think is interesting is typically there's two kinds of leads. There's the asset lead, right? So I'm looking for properties, I'm looking for people that are selling properties, or there's the tenant lead, right? So I'm looking for someone to come in and rent those properties from me. And I think you have to look at that from a segmentation standpoint too. So there's a lot of tools out there that are easy for the consumer to pick up and implement that allow for point and click implementation, right? You don't necessarily have to write code to have something working for you on a regular basis. Infusionsoft, I think, is a fairly good example of that. It's not that pricey. You can point and click and build funnels. You can go and do ad campaigns, point links back into Infusionsoft landing pages, and gather all the information, and then figure out what follow-up methods you want for that to be, right? Mm-hmm. You can also keep them in a customer database and continue to work them. And there's a lot of CRM, customer relationship management tools that will offer that for you. Internally here, we use a lot of open source tools because we don't tend to find what we need out of the box. And me personally, having the background that I've had, I've always done the same thing. So we buy open source because we can customize it to fit more easily, right? And you bring a couple developers on board and you can get there. So from a personal perspective, some examples of what I've done in the past is, and I talked a little bit about this at the show, we own some properties in the Kansas City area, and I didn't want to go overkill with technology. So instead of using one big package, I kind of scrapped together a couple of little ones. I grabbed an Atlassian account, which had a free account up to 5 users hosted, and used that for a ticketing system.
So just to clarify, what is Atlassian?
So Atlassian is a company that builds a couple of different products that do, Jira, for example, is issue or ticket tracking. They have Confluence as well, which is kind of like collaborative documentation. So I would say it's enterprise level efficiency software.
Okay.
Or management software. I use Jira, which was the issue or ticket tracking system. And in a lot of our properties, what I did is I set up a Gmail account for free that was like a support. Every property had its own Gmail account. If one of my tenants ever had an issue, they could send an email to that email address. It would send an email to me, but it would also automatically log a ticket, right? Once that ticket was logged, it would notify my maintenance guy or myself or my wife or anybody else that we had working with us at that time of what the issue was. And then you had a date, time, you had notes, you had subjects, and oftentimes I didn't even have to make contact. The maintenance guy would go, oh, the hot water heater's leaking. I'm going to go take care of it. They could hop out, take care of the hot water heater, put notes back on the ticket. And every time a note was made on the ticket, I would also get notified of that. And it kind of just ran fairly smoothly. Now, I had taken the time to have a good relationship with a maintenance guy. I had found some people I trusted to work with. I had found some people that were a little bit lower maintenance and a little bit more tech savvy. They were younger guys. So it was an easy thing for me to do. Mm-hmm. I did some similar things from a tenant finding perspective. So, using Google AdWords and doing really small circle geotargeting. So focusing on some really specific areas in the Kansas City area who had an audience that I knew I wanted. In this case, it was military. Mm-hmm. So there's a large military base not too far off the Kansas City area. And we had an idea that military people are probably really good tenants. And it turned out to work in our favor. So we started doing a lot of geo-targeted ad buying to find tenants that were on base that were looking for better school systems, because the school systems in the area that the base was located in weren't as good as the neighboring communities were. But it was a 7-mile drive into the better school system. So we kind of advertised from that perspective and ended up finding several tenants that we rented to for multiple years. And very seldom do you get to give a security deposit back in whole.
Yeah,
but
that's a good point.
Yeah, when those tenants moved out, I mean, the properties looked just like the day they moved in. So, yeah, some of that worked out.
So I want to dive into that real quick, because I think that you're touching on something that I think a lot of people would be interested in. So when you say that you did advertising focused on that, so did you create Google Ads campaigns that were lined up for people that were also searching for things like good schools, or that Google, for a variety of reasons, had the background that they were military clients? Or was it you were basing it on the location of the fact that you knew where the military base was? And just talk us through how you really identified those people in such a small area.
So we wanted people that were coming into that base that had families, because we knew that if they had a family, a younger family, schools mattered. What we did, from a Google perspective, it was really just geo-focused. Okay. And we didn't have as much success in Google as we did in Facebook. So in Facebook, we really came in and kind of lined out the geographic from an age, family perspective. We did a purchase that was geo-specific for that zip code or those couple of zip codes in that direct area. And we started serving ads about, how their kids deserve and how they deserve to put their kids in great schools.
Wow.
That, we said, we're so grateful for the honor that they give us by serving our country. Your kids should have the same opportunities that every other kid has, whether you're on base or not. And basically kind of went down that road and really pushed the school angle to people with families. Most of what we had were three bedroom places. So they were a little bit more family oriented, and the response was pretty high. The other thing that we did is we went on base and did a lot of kind of hand-to-hand marketing, a lot of one-sheeters, a lot of different things like that. Also, we targeted with some of our ads, and I can't remember the title of the people that help new military personnel move into that area, but we started targeting some of them, and they started reaching out to us to see what living opportunities were in surrounding communities. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a lot of key takeaways there. One of the things that I've heard reoccurringly through this conversation about with others as well is that Facebook's ability to pinpoint a target market, is really better than a lot of the competitors out there. Has that been your experience? Is that Facebook is better than Google? You mentioned that, but is it also better than Instagram? I mean, is that Facebook platform the ideal in terms of where your marketing spend is going?
So I would never go as far to say that. Okay. I think it all depends on the audience that you're looking for and the success that you're having while you're doing it, right? We actually started that buy on Google, and we just, having been in an advertising career for a long time, we weren't getting the results that I thought we'd been getting from other campaigns I ran in other places. The age range of that audience and the family-oriented nature of that audience, Facebook worked really well, because I think that 35 to 45 audience is a little bit more of an active Facebook user than your more millennial or, early 20s audiences, right?
Yeah.
If I was trying to hit that early 20s audience, I would probably look at a different platform, because you see a lot less of them on Facebook. And I think a lot of them take Facebook not very seriously anymore.
Yeah, I agree.
Probably where I'd go to the Instagram or...
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. It lines up with my perspective as well. I have younger sisters. They have lots of Instagram followers, not because they post a lot or even put a lot of attention towards it. It's much more, that age group is much more dedicated to that platform. And Facebook is something that like people's parents have from their perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. So when it comes to, I guess, Think Realty or Affinity Worldwide, you mentioned that you're doing a lot of open source things so that you can bring a developer on and make something that's more integrated with your personal system. So, for example, like a CRM, do you guys have a CRM that someone else can go out and buy, or is that something that's, proprietary essentially that you guys created?
Yeah, so it's a little bit of both. Okay. Some of our assets use things like Infusionsoft. They're a little bit more self-contained. We have technology that we've built that is an underlying platform to all of the core assets that we have for this space. So we have built technology that basically allows our users to travel between those assets very seamlessly and very quickly. And that's a lot of what our 2018 and 2019 effort is focused on, is creating a better user experience for all the brands within Affinity. What we've typically done is we use Suite CRM, which is an open source version of Sugar CRM. And a lot of that is done because we can create quick views into that layer of data that I'm talking about that can be managed by the different asset leaders. So anybody can download Suite CRM for free. The amount of customization that we've done to it, though, is not available for public use. And I don't know that it would be relevant because it's really focused on what we consider our data set.
Yeah, that makes sense. Just to let the listeners know, I've had a lot of success with Pipedrive. It's extremely simple. It's very cost efficient, and it's great for sales, moving things along. I will say, though, just to be transparent, the changes that Google made recently in their Gmail is actually really beneficial. So if you're setting reminders and doing things like that, I don't think it's wise to exclusively rely on something like Gmail, but it does help in terms of follow-up or sending follow-up messages. Mixmax is also a great one, which I have talked about again on the program before, which is kind of a integration with Gmail to make that more efficient. Yep. You can find out when people have opened your emails and things like that, which can be helpful in terms of moving things along at a speed that's anything other than molasses, which is basically the goal of my business.
Yeah, and HubSpot's another one that integrates really well with it. And there's a few others too. We tend to use a little bit bigger tools, so we use some Salesforce tools. We use, what was ExactTarget and some things like that for email marketing. We use some bigger social media tools as well.
Okay.
So, and a lot of it is just the amount of context that you have. And again, what you're trying to accomplish, I think if you're not ready for CRM and you don't know what you want out of a CRM, implementing it can be detrimental to your business. You almost land in analysis paralysis, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Especially if you get a complicated one. That's one of the reasons why I like Pipedrive so much. But I think it makes sense given the complexities of what you guys are in the process of accomplishing. Mentioned 85 brands that you're representing to one degree and the other, or working with. You probably don't need just a simple 1, 2, 3 step process in your CRM. So it makes sense. Yep. Which actually brings me to a good point. There's been a lot of changes taking place. Well, first of all, we should start with the Jobs Act. The Jobs Act allowed people to essentially publicly advertise for real estate transactions online in a way that they hadn't really been able to previously. And this compounded with the fact that millennials are now starting to be in a financial position where they can invest through online. So you have this combination of all these people that are now accredited investors for the first time in their lives. They grew up with the internet. They're very comfortable with the internet, and they can make investments. But we're trying to drive that ship in a way that's efficient. And it sounds like if you go in all directions, you're not really going to get anything done, especially if you're a relatively small company. So I say that all to ask, when it comes to the social media platforms, what do you see as being the most effective ways? It doesn't have to be necessarily social media, but in terms of online personas, what do you see as being some of the most effective ways to acquire leads, nurture leads, and close sales?
So that's interesting. And I think social media is a great way to talk about that because it's probably where you do most of your persona development, right? I think a website, for example, is really supporting architecture for how you've put your personality out there from a social perspective, because a lot of your voice or brand voice is captured that way. There's kind of 3 things that we tend to focus on from a social perspective, and that's transparency, information, and entertainment, right? And then having a healthy mix of those 3 things while you build your brand and the voice that you want is really, really important. We tend to focus on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. We do some Instagram. We do some Instagram ad buying as well. And we've seen some success there. It's hard to find the same return on Instagram that it is on the other platforms, but we're a little bit more numbers oriented probably than the smaller brands are. I think the thing about building any kind of online persona is being consistent and being frequent, right? Like once you've decided who you want to be, or once you've figured out who you are online, it's important to continue. Like if you stop, it dies, right? The attention span in America, I think the last research paper that I looked at said that it had dropped 7 seconds over the course of 5 years. Don't quote me on that. That's a ton of time, right? Like we've lost 7 seconds of attention in the course of 5 years. I think that you have to be aware of that. And I think that whatever it is that you're putting out there, your users need to find valuable or you're not going to have them anymore, right? I read a really interesting research paper on the HGTV phenomenon and why it's been so successful with users. And one of the things they talked about is that learning is loyalty. In most HGTV shows, not in all of them, but in most of them, the average consumer takes something away from that show that they can implement themselves in their home. And once they've been able to implement that by themselves or at home, there's a reward there, right? It's a personal reward. It's fulfillment. Maybe it's even functional. Maybe it's cost savings. Maybe it's equity raising, but it's rewarding. And that has generated a significant amount of the loyalty that HGTV sees. They got something out of it, so they obviously tune back in and continue to watch. I think you've seen the same phenomenon with Pinterest, right? A lot of it is things that are easy to take home, recipes, craft ideas, things like that, that creates that very loyal user or listener. I think, that's one approach that you can take, or one thing that you can keep in mind when you're looking at how you've done your mix on social, how transparent you're being, what kind of information you're putting out there, and how you're educating people, is to keep that in mind. I think the other thing is I don't know in today's market if it's fair to expect users to come to you. There's a lot going on the online world, and it's really noisy, and the highest signal typically wins. I think you have to go out there and find your users and speak to what they want to hear. And if they're not listening, maybe you're not talking about the right things.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you just dropped so many bombs of knowledge that I completely agree with. And I haven't spent as much time as you have analyzing and, considering what you just said. But I think that the example of HTV is actually perfect, especially when you have the complete change in the podcast community, which has taken place over the last 2 years in particular. Thousands of podcasts have been started and have been uploaded on iTunes for the first time ever in the history of ever. Yeah. And there's going to be a significant change, I am predicting, from that volume game to the real educational component. And so we have been able to, focus on our weekly podcast, for example, as opposed to doing something daily, which we may not be able to get into the same level of detail. I do think that there's going to be a shift towards that, because at this point, the sector is very saturated. But if you're actually providing really significantly dense content, which people can take away something from every single episode, I think that you're right. That reward which they receive by using that information is going to really, it's going to make them be a permanent customer to some degree or the other. It may just be that they're always going to be a listener of your educational content, but it may be that they may be a client of yours at some point, which I think is the goal for a lot of podcasts and other marketing that people are doing right now. Yeah. So the point is really well taken. One of the ways that people are in the process of converting potential clients to close deals is email. And I think that still plays an absolutely critical role in any lead nurturing campaign. So I wanted to hear your perspective on the state of email, given the changes of social media and everything else, and TV and YouTube and all that out there. And in that context of your, the changes that have taken place in email, or the lack thereof, what are your thoughts on marketing campaigns directed as email as being the vehicle?
Sure. So we take email pretty seriously internally here. Our view on an email address is that if someone gives you an email address, that's almost a better connection than you having them in your social network, right? It's very similar to having a phone number in today's world. So an email address is considered lower in the funnel from our perspective than social is. And a lot of it is because we can communicate directly to that person, right? So when I say we take that seriously, what I mean is we try really hard not to abuse it. Mm-hmm. We try to be as high signal as we can. We stay very conscious about send times. We try not to send on holidays, a lot of those things. So we do that because we try to respect the end user that gave us that email address. Because if someone is willing to give you an email address, I think it signifies a deeper level of interest than just a social follow, right? You're no longer just part of the stream. That being said, there's a lot of best practice email that's out there. And then there's a lot of things that contradict best practice email. I think you have to know your audience. I think that if you are looking at your email list like you looked at your Rolodex 20 years ago, you've got a good start. What do they want to hear? How should I be communicating to them? What's signal and what's noise? And then The great thing about email that you never had on the telephone is you get data, you get metrics. You know how many people are opening it. You can see how many unsubscribes you get on a regular basis. You know what content gets opened more than other content. You know what headlines work and what headlines don't work. And I think it's our responsibility as brand builders in this industry to continue to hone the message for our users so that they get what they need as quickly as possible.
Yeah, again, I think that's a great point. And I'm actually, I'm thinking about that thoroughly because I think you're right. Even the difference of the last 3 or 4 years, the change of what an email really means, especially because now most people have 2 emails, right? They have their spam email and they have their real email. And if you're in the business of real estate, you have to be very cautious about that because if you're trying to communicate with them or issue tax documents via email or something like that, which I don't necessarily suggest, but I know a lot of people are doing it. If you're issuing sensitive material or time sensitive material or you're requesting signatures, you need to be sure that you're on that white list and you're on the actual email address that they frequently check. And the way to do that is to make sure that when you're communicating with them, you're actually adding value so that they don't unsubscribe. Because boy, oh boy, if you spend all that time, energy, and expertise trying to acquire leads, particularly something like an accredited investor who is very valuable, you don't want to lose them over something like sending out spam emails, which are functionally spam emails. Yeah. Now, I will say that the people that you do contact, if you do contact them frequently, they're going to be very aligned with your perspective on investing. And therefore, they could be a much more valuable client than someone who may say, hey, you sent me 2 emails this month. This is not appropriate. I'm unsubscribing. So you're trying to balance those 2 things. And there may be something to be said about sectioning off your email list so that people can unsubscribe to certain components, subscribe to certain components, make sure they always get investment opportunities from you, but don't get your weekly newsletter or something like that. And this conversation is definitely making me think about that because I want to add as much value as possible, but I also don't want to lose potential investors. So it's always a balancing act. And I want to get your thoughts on the internet as a whole and the real estate sector. I know that there's been a lot of talk about, the retail sector, for example, which is going through a major shift, mostly because of the internet, if not, consumer prices, consumer changes based on the internet. I'd like to get your perspective on that. What shifts are you seeing taking place in the sector as a result of these technological solutions, but also the internet as a whole?
That's an interesting question. And I feel like I have to buffer this a little bit between my opinions and my ideas, right?
Yeah, okay.
So I think that we're definitely seeing a higher level of autonomous transactions in the real estate market than we've ever seen before, for sure, right? Like I think real estate was largely considered a see it, touch it, know it, buy it process. And I think in today's market, because of the internet and because of accessibility, you're seeing more sight unseen purchases than we've ever had, right? Which is what I consider an autonomous transaction. You may never meet your buyer face to face, right?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's happening more and more.
Yep. So I think that's interesting. I think that there's a lot of things that have happened in the real estate tech space. And then I think there's a lot of things that haven't happened in the real estate tech space. And I don't know which is more important. I feel like to some degree, we've overvalued property data and we're getting to a point where now we're not sure what the value of property data is. I think that the real value around that property data is probably more around the services that come along with it rather than the data itself. I think that there's so much of it out there and in so many different forms that we question its validity at times. I think that it's been happening since the birth of the industry. I think that, I remember sitting around conference rooms 19 years ago talking about who owned the data, the MLS or the broker, right? And I don't know that some of those questions have gotten resolved today.
When you say property data, what does that refer to?
The attributes of a property directly related to the address, the square footage, the beds and baths, the lot size, right? Like, all of that kind of primary property information, like its value is either in the transaction of that data or in the services that we can offer around that data. But the data itself has been hoarded over the last 20 years. And I don't know that real value has been built into the data, right?
Okay, I'm interested in this topic, but I think that my understanding is limited. So could you explain kind of what you mean when you're saying that the data has been hoarded? like from my perspective, I can Google something like that very quickly, but are you saying that there's value there that has not been tapped into in some way?
So what I'm saying is I think that the value over the last probably 15 years has been misplaced. I think that a lot of big companies went out to try to aggregate all of that property information that they could. It was information typically only available on the MLS and not largely available to the consumer, right?
Okay, wait. So I'm interested. So if it's available on the MLS, how is it not available to the consumer? Just to clarify, if they're if they have an MLS login, for example, they can log in and see the information. But I'm assuming I'm missing a point there.
I wouldn't consider that consumer because most consumers don't have an MLS login.
I see what you mean. So you're talking about people like the everyday citizen, for example.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, most investors that I know are not licensed agents.
Right, for sure.
Yep.
For sure. But even though that is the case, I believe that I can Google like lot sizes on random properties, right?
Today you can. You know, 15 years ago you couldn't. The reason that you can today is because a lot of these bigger companies outside of the MLSs went out and said, we need as much property information that we can. I think that during that period, and we kind of, from a technology perspective, we went through this big data push over the last 10 years as well, where everywhere you went, you heard big data, big data, big data, right? Mm-hmm. I think a lot of those companies are going, okay, we've got all this data. What do we do with it? Right? I think the thing that worries me the most is that we have yet to build a transactional standard in the investment space of this industry that the non-investment space or the MLS space has created, right? The agent, broker, title company has a transactional standard. There's a process that you go through. It's largely the same. And I think when you come over into the investor side of it, that transaction is not necessarily standardized. Every individual might do it a little bit differently. The docs that they want, the docs that they require, different lenders require different things, right? There's only a couple of points in there that I think are common. You know, title searches are a fairly common part of that. Depending on how you lend could be common parts of that. I think the biggest opportunity that we have as an industry, if we're ever going to be truly defined as an industry, is to start creating some standards around some of those things. What is the property data standard? What is the property transaction standard? Is there one place that we can go to access all these things? And maybe blockchain is a solution for that going forward.
Very interesting. Well, I actually, unless you want to follow up with that, I mean, I actually think that's a really interesting note to end on because it really is unclear. We really don't know. And I do think that we have heard this, the term big data has been completely overused at this point, but there's really no telling in where the industry is going to go because of the shift that's been taking place. Is there anything else that you wanted to add to that?
No, I mean, I think that's a really high level view. And like I said, there's a difference for me between opinion and idea. I think that we are seeing more activity from the real estate investor side of this market than we've ever seen in the past, in my opinion. And I think at a much wider rate, right? So I think there was a lot of activity that happened with a few people 10 years ago. I think now you're seeing a lot of activity happening with a lot of people, which I think is really exciting. I think that there is still a lot of pieces of this that are unknown because of the lack of standardization that doesn't allow for an adoption curve to occur.
Interesting. Well, I know that this conversation will be changing every 6 months like it does every single time there's any kind of evolution in the tech space, which is every single day. So we should definitely keep an eye on that conversation and you know, I'd love to have you back on in 6 months or 12 months to kind of recycle back because there's going to be some shifts that are taking place as there always is. Yeah. Especially real estate moves rather slowly, but tech moves very quickly. And so you can see massive shifts and integrations and implementations take place where 12 months ago, there can be completely new sectors or completely new industries developed in the tech space. And the real estate's the vehicle for the tech, but it's something we'll keep an eye on. But before we would jump off, I want to give the opportunity to tell the listeners a little bit more about how they can learn more about you and your firm.
Yeah, absolutely. You can find Rivet, our technology and marketing firm, at wearerivet.com. That's WEARERIV as in Victor, ET.com. A lot of our portfolio work is out there. From a real estate brands perspective or core assets focused in this industry, you can go to affinityworldwide.com.
Awesome. Well, we will link to those in the show notes page. Tyler, really an honor to have you on. Thanks again, buddy.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me, Hunter. I appreciate it.
All right, listeners, thanks for checking out the episode. As always, the contact information for our guest will be available in the show notes page, which is hosted on SoundCloud, iTunes, and Stitcher. Don't forget, if you want access to some of the free goodies that I'm talking about at the beginning of these episodes, like free ebooks, weekly investor emails, and articles about some of the most important investment-related topics, make sure that you have created an account with CFC because this stuff is automatically available. You can do this by going to cashflowconnections.com and signing up as an accredited investor. Of course, if you have any questions, feel free to email me at hunterthompson@cashflowconnections.com. Thanks again.